Привіт, I'm Chuck Olinik. I'm a Ukrainian-American. I was baptized with the name Yaroslav, and that also happens to be the name that I use in the reenactment organization, the Society for Creative Anachronism. A little while ago, I decided that I would take a lot of the research that I had done on Slavic folklore and turn this research into videos, because videos seem to be easier to access. And this is the fourth one. I thought I would be starting off with one of the main gods, Perun, the god of thunder, and because he was like the favorite of the military aristocracy, and pretty much, peasants would carve thunder signs to protect their homes, on the eaves of their houses. I thought he'd be number one. Well, that didn't happen because I realized I had to go with one of the most obvious Slavic figures that would be easily recognizable, Chernobyl. Because, hey, Disney, Fantasia, all right, American gods. So I had to cover him and Bieleboch, and that was the first installment in this series that I call Tales of the Borderland, and sometimes I'll call Tales from the Borderland because sometimes I mess up on the title. And then I ended up having to do with the creator god, Rod, and his first creation, Svarog. Okay, that was the second installment. And then I realized I needed to do the history, the backstory, so that you could have some context in looking at these gods. So that was the third installment for Kyiv Rus, not Kiev and Kyiv. All right, and now we are finally getting to talk about these main gods. Here we go. We're finally getting to the top of the hill, guys. Okay, the primary chronicle relates that in the year 6415, that was like 907 by the common reckoning, Prince Oleg, Old Norse name would be Helgi, made peace with the Byzantine Empire, and he took his men to shrines, and they swore by their weapons, and by the god Perun, and by the guy Veles, or Volos, the god of cattle. They confirmed the treaty. Prince Ihor is going to do the same thing about 945. Same type of confirmation of a peace treaty. And in 980, Prince Volodymyr the Great comes to the throne of Kyiv, and he erects these statues of 6 pagan gods at Starokyivska, or Old Kyiv Hill. And they're dedicated to Perun, the god of thunder, who was favored by the military elite and the Druzhina. Veles, or Volos, that god of cattle that I mentioned, Stribog and Dashbog, Mokosh, horse, and Simarhil. It's here, near Volodymyr's palace, prior to his conversion, 8 years later, that plant and animal and occasionally human sacrifices were brought. With Prince Volodymyr's conversion to Christianity and the mass baptism of his people, where he herded them into the Dnipro River, the idols are dethroned, and they were dragged down in great dishonor, and they were dragged through the streets, and they were beaten with rods before they get thrown into the Dnipro River and not permitted to land on shore. Okay, now we actually get to the gods, so we're going to take a look at the god Perun. As I've written earlier, and I put in another video, Perun wasn't always the chief Slavic god. That was probably Rod, the creator god, and following him would be Svarog, the divine smith, who, on his anvil, with the blood that Rod spilled upon the anvil, created the rest of the gods. And maybe it isn't in every Slavic pantheon, because I can kind of vary from group to group, but in most of them, Perun is considered the supreme god. And that might have to do with the military elite. I'm going to get to that in just a bit. Probably the earliest historic reference to Perun, unlike other ones that I'd mentioned, goes back to the 6th century. Procopius, a Byzantine writer, he was secretary to Count Belisarius, ended up making note of a supreme god who was the creator of lightning, and he made mention of some animal sacrifices. And while that god wasn't named specifically, researchers pretty much figured out, who this guy is. The creator of thunder and lightning. His name came to me, well, either thunder or lightning. There's a root word meaning to strike, and that would be Perun. So here's Perun, the highest ranking god of the Slavs in Kyiv and Rus. As I already said, he's god of thunder, god of lightning. There are portrayals of him as a man with a silver head and a golden mustache. Sometimes he's shown like the Germanic Thor, as a rugged man, and he's got a copper beard. He rides across the sky in a fiery chariot that's pulled by a billy goat. Chariot thing is real common amongst thunder gods in different cultures. He's sometimes known as the Thunder Emperor, and his retinues, the princes of thunder, the nobles of the clouds, and they're clothed in iron, and before him travel pipers and trumpeters and cymbal players. Basically, you got a bunch of noisy instruments, and they're part of the thunder realm. He commands the elements: the wind, the rain, frost, drought, thunder, lightning, hail, and he commands them to create havoc or to make rescue. It's kind of depending upon his mood. And it makes sense that he sends, that his messengers are the whirlwind and the thunder and the hail, and he bombards the lands of the wicked with these things. He also carries a bunch of magical weapons. He was first associated with weapons made of stone, later made of metal. He carries a hammer sometimes, kind of Thor-like, or a mace, or an axe, and the axe is hurled at evil people and spirits and always returns to his hand, a bit like Thor. Okay, the axe of Perun is worn as an amulet. Similar to Thor's hammer, miniature amulets were worn by pre-Christian Slavs as pendants honoring their pagan god. 2 basic designs of the axe have been found throughout Rus and its boundaries. Specimens of both designs include a hole in the center of the blade, and both have been decorated with zigzag lines representing lightning near the edge of the blade. Some accounts say that Perun's axe is used to cast the lightning. Other accounts say, no, Perun has a whole arsenal of weapons in his chariot, and one of them happens to be a magical bow, which, why magical? Because he's a god, all right? A magical bow which bursts into flame, and with that he uses to fire his arrows, which are lightning bolts. And the lightning bolts hit the ground, and they will travel to a certain depth. And after a certain period of time has passed, the figure I heard was 7 years, 40 days, which is oddly specific. The weapons return to the surface, and they could return in the form of an oak tree. So the oak tree is sacred to Perun. Or they could return in the form of grain, or long black stones, which were used to preserve the people in the land from lightning. There's another last holy weapon that needs to get mentioned. In Slavic myth, there are golden apple trees, and they're associated with Perun. They represent ball lightning or just raw power. And the multi-headed dragon Zmi, which I mentioned him in the previous video, he either guards or tries to steal the apples. There's also kind of a connection to the god Veles or Volos that I'm going to mention in the next chapter. This may not seem like much of a weapon, but this was considered in a number of Slavic folk accounts to be like an ultimate talisman for destruction. Apparently, you can find the remains of Perun's lightning bolts. According to folk beliefs, Fulgurites and Belemnites, and sometimes even the remains of prehistoric stone tools. They're found in the ground, and these are considered to be the remains of his weapons. Various Slavic countries call these deposits Perun stones, thunderbolt wedges, Perun's arrow, and then I guess when you start drifting into Christian territory, they might be called the devil's finger or God's finger or mother of God's finger. And then you start to get into like Lithuania, and it could be referred to as Perkun's finger, because we're going to be mentioning some of the crossover with the Baltic countries as well. Okay, and these thunderbolt stones were sometimes said to be transferred back to the sky by the wind after being under the earth for that 7 years, 40 days thing, and that these weapons were protection against evil magic, against disease, and naturally enough, against lightning. Like many Indo-European thunder gods, oaks are particularly sacred to Perun. That's what we talked about, lightning hitting and oak trees growing there. So, if you got a number of oak trees around, if there's a real prominent one, or a really distinctive one, hey, that one's going to become really sacred. And, the idea of, hey, if one oak tree is good, if you've got a forest grove of them, or if you've got oak wooded hills, you have a sacred site. And there were, in southern Slavic regions, there were marked oaks that communities would, villages would visit on village holidays, and that in the late spring and in the summer. By the way, Perun's sacred day on the calendar is July 20th. Sacred day of the week is Thursday. Ooh, kind of like Thor's Day. And people would go there to sacrifice, and what they would do is they would, be whirling and drinking, which kind of go together. Major parts of his worship, and cattle, and live cocks, and bulls, and bears, and billy goats, and other animals. Even eggs would be sacrificed to him. Arrows were then pegged around the tree, I guess to kind of mark that, hey, this tree is important. And there was actually a rain-making ritual, which I think is kind of funny right now because as I'm filming this, it's raining, like really bad. A chaste girl, naked and draped with flowers, whirls in the middle of a ring. Okay, so someone somewhere is probably doing that. Okay, in addition to the tree association and the day of the week and all that, we've got to get the idea. When the Slavs get Christianized, Perun is going to kind of go through a transformation, and I guess because of his popularity, he gets to be transformed into the prophet Ilya, or Elijah. And so, again, the July 20th thing, that becomes important. So there were remains of an ancient shrine to Perun discovered in Perun, which I think is in Bulgaria, and it's on the highest mountain in the Balkans. Because, hey, really tall mountains, and bald mountains especially, Perun thought they were really cool. And it consisted of a wide circular platform that was centered around a statue, and it was encircled with a trench. The trench had 8 apses, which contained sacrificial altars, and maybe there were other statues there. The overall plan of the shrine shows a really clear symbolism for like the number 9. And that's sometimes interpreted that Perun, in fact, had 9 sons, or maybe there was 8 sons in Perun, which add up to 9. And in some Slavic folk songs, 9 unnamed brothers are mentioned. So Slavic traditions and very ancient elements kind of intermingled with neighboring European people. And you could go to an example of, there's not just Perun as the Lord of Thunder. There could be Peperuna or Dodola or Perunica as the counterparts who have a Lord and Lady Thunder. And that could be, that was also kind of picked up like with the Albanians who don't even belong to the same language family, and the Greeks who also don't even belong to the same language family. And you can find that also in the Baltic, where you have Perkunas and Dundulis, or Perkuna. And that gets into the whole Baltic thing. The Lithuanians call him Perkunas, the Latvians call him Perkuns. And maybe that suggests a common source, or maybe that just was simply borrowing because they're neighbors. And there was an analogy I would use with my students all the time of 2 cultures come together and they start to share traits and they start to share words. And apparently there's a root word from the Baltic that kind of made it over to the Finns, and there's the Finnish deity Ukko. And they belong to a different language family. All right, besides being a part Slavic, Baltic, Finnish thing, Perun's also related to an archaic form of astronomy. The Slavs believed in a world tree. The pole star represents the top of the tree, and in some cases the pole star is called Perun's eye. And there were a lot of Polish and Hungarian astronomers who mentioned that, and apparently it was part of their tradition. And I'm going to name probably one of the really super famous Polish astronomers, Nicholas Copernicus, who apparently used that name for that star. He had enough similarity to Thor, and maybe what ended up happening is the Norse that were coming in, the Scandinavians, who were becoming part of the Druzhina, they may have just gone native. And there was enough similarity, they just simply replaced Thor the Thunder with the purely Slavic god Perun. His worship in the late 10th century, that's going to kind of push Rod and Svarog out of favor and amongst the aristocrats, amongst the ruling class. And his name was invoked by rulers and the elite, as well as warriors, but really pretty much everybody's kind of invoking Perun. His symbol, the thunder sign, the Hromznyak, that was carved on houses for protection, usually high up. That was to protect you against lightning and other badness. It could also go on shields and weapons in order to gain power, inspiration, and secure the god's blessing. And there's a couple of different versions of those that I've seen. One which looks sort of like a 6-petaled rose. One looks like it just has 6 points to it, which sort of look like petals. One looks sort of like a stylized S, which always makes me think Superman every time I see it. In addition to his duties as the Lord of Thunder and the God of War, Perun's also the chief adjudicator of the gods, and his decision's going to be final. He might listen to reason, but once it's made up, that's it, it's done. And maybe that's a reason he ends up becoming the god of law and justice. And because, hey, he's being worshipped by the ruling class. So, all right, that covered Perun, which was a lot of stuff. In the next video, I hope to cover Veles or Volos, who was one of the gods on the hill, and sometimes he's kind of put into fights with Perun, and that just might be because the monks who are recording this are going, yep, that's it. God, the devil. So we'll see. I hope you stick with me on my journey.